They called it a place for children, a ribbon of lights on the edge of town, a summer that never had to end. The brochure promised salt air and cotton candy, a Ferris wheel that kissed the sky, and a haunted funhouse with mirrors that made you into a dozen versions of yourself. The brochure did not mention what the mirrors kept after you walked away. According to official records, Ashdown Pier Amusement Park opened in 1972 and closed one night in the mid-1990s after an outage that the fire department later described as a grid failure with anomalous overcurrents. The newspapers said the park never recovered from the bad press, but the people who grew up along the Jersey coast, who can still smell the electricity and ocean mixed together, tell a different story, that the park shut down because something woke up in the dark. And once it woke, it started recognizing faces. The last summer it was alive, in 1996. I was 12 and counted years by wristbands. I remember the whine of rides winding down at closing, the boards of the pier flexing under the weight of a crowd that felt like one animal with 1,000 shoes. I remember a man at the edge of the crowd who did not blink, and a woman in a white uniform who never turned her head, only her eyes. I remember the funhouse called the Hollow Mile, where the air was 5 degrees colder and your breath came back to you after you spoke, delayed by a fraction of a second, as if someone behind the glass were repeating what you said softly, like a prayer. But the park's story doesn't begin with me. It begins with a different summer, when the park had money to spare and a designer with an appetite for strange ideas. His name on paper was Martin Delaney, installation artist turned commercial designer hired in 1989 to refresh the guest experience. Internally, he was praised as the one who would make Ashdown Pier compete with bigger parks up the coast. In the months before his arrival, attendance had fallen. The old wooden coaster rattled like a crate of silverware. The arcade smelled of mildew and salt. Delaney was given a small budget and a large amount of freedom. According to a 1990 planning memo recovered years later from a storage unit, when the park was auctioned off, Delaney proposed a reimagined mirror labyrinth leveraging controlled light and sound to create the sensation of displacement he wrote of sound behaving like water, of reflection as a threshold. He included a sketch that looked like an eye drawn inside a spiral. In the margins, someone had circled the sketch and written, in pencil, no symbols. The park approved. The Hollow Mile reopened Memorial Day weekend 1991 with a new facade. A stylized wave frozen over a mouth as if the sea itself were about to swallow you. Inside, the path had changed. The mirrors were taller, the angles sharper, the floor slightly cambered so you leaned without noticing. Speakers hidden in the ceiling emitted a low hum at the limit of hearing. If you stood still, you could feel the hum in your molars. On opening weekend, the park received 3 separate complaints. All 3 said the same thing with different words. The mirrors did not reflect correctly. One woman wrote, "My son's reflection looked like he had his mouth open when it wasn't." A teenage guest said the mirrors lagged, as though they were old screens refreshing on a bad connection. Only it was glass and it showed you after you had already moved. The park filed the complaints away. The Hollow Mile became the park's most popular attraction, especially after the marketing department leaned in, posters printed in high contrast black and white, radio ads with a whisper at the end, "How long can you look at yourself?" The line for the funhouse snaked past the corn dog stand and the tilt-a-whirl. The barkers learned to sell the wait. You've got time to see who you are. In September 1992, a maintenance technician named Luis Andrade filed a formal report about the labyrinth's electric. He wrote that the ride's breaker tripped without load event, that the line voltage spiked beyond spec while the grid input showed nominal, that he smelled ionization in the mirror corridors even when the ride was idle. He drew a diagram of the labyrinth's wiring that made sense to no one but him and underlined a sentence at the end. This is not how a building behaves. Luis's report never left the park office, but copies were made. One of them ended up in the file of a private inspector hired the next year after a child went missing for 29 minutes inside the labyrinth. Missing is the word the official report used. The reality is stranger. The girl's mother maintained that the child was walking directly in front of her, visible in the mirror, but when the mother reached the bend where the girl should have been, the corridor was empty and cold. Staff found the girl 29 minutes later, sitting on the exit stairs, not crying, only staring, with damp salt on her cheeks as if she had been near the ocean spray for hours. When the staff asked where she'd gone, the girl said, with the soft certainty of a child telling a truth no one will believe, "I followed my other mom." After that, the park increased staffing at the funhouse and installed a turnstile with a counter. Off the record, a supervisor asked the attendants to stop the flow if guests began to double. Doubling was the staff word for when the glass showed 2 of you, one fractionally behind the other, matching your movements with a slight delay. "People get scared if you say ghost," the supervisor said in a training meeting. "Say double. It sounds technical. People like technical." In June 1993, a thunderstorm rolled up the coast and parked over Ashdown for 2 days. The pier swelled and groaned. Salt water pushed up between the boards and left crystals when it sank back. The Hollow Mile stayed open because it always did. The park had learned that rain made the mirror maze busier. Halfway through the second day, at 4:17 p.m., all the lights cut out at once and the hum in the ceiling rose into a tone like a kettle boiling. The emergency lights should have come on, Luis said so later, his voice rising. They didn't. It was not a fire, not exactly. It was a brightening that felt like heat on your skin and left no marks on the walls. When the power returned, 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, several guests reported seeing the corridor extend in both directions at once, impossible angles, the exit on both sides. One man refused to step off the rubber mat because the glass on his left showed him leaving and the glass on his right showed him still standing. I didn't know which one was me, he told his wife. She laughed in the telling, all those years later, then put her hand flat to her own throat and said in a quieter voice, "He never went back to the park after that." The park hired a second private inspector. His report repeated the obvious and missed the important. Faulty grounding, corroded contacts, unacceptable humidity. He wrote, "Replace all mirrored panels. Current panels are irregular glass and may be production seconds," as if the behavior of the reflections could be blamed on manufacturing defects. He did not ask why the panels in the service corridor, the plain ones used by staff, recorded the same anomalies in the maintenance logs. In the fall of 1993, the park paid a consultant to design a Halloween overlay for the Hollow Mile. They called it Blackout Nights, the lights taken down to almost nothing, the corridors lit by tiny blue lamps like stars caught in a net, a soundtrack of carnival music played back slowly until it bled. The marketing promised 90 seconds you won't forget. The posters used a photo of the right entrance with a child's face half visible in the ticket window glass, though the park photographer swore he had been alone when he took the shot. Blackout Nights sold out. People brought dates and dared each other to let go of hands inside. They exited arm in arm, some laughing too loudly, some looking down as if ashamed even of the laughter. On the fourth night, an attendant named Mara took a Polaroid in the service corridor of herself and another attendant. She waved the photo to develop it, and when the faces showed, hers was correct. The other girl's was not. It was of a different person. A woman older by 10 years, hair longer, a small scar above the right eyebrow that the attendant did not have. The photo faded to black over the next hour. Mara kept it in her locker anyway, and the locker smelled of ozone until the season ended. There's a pattern if you look at the complaints. Someone did, later, when the town's insurance committee had to justify why the pier was going to be condemned. The pattern is that the worst nights were the ones when the wind came in steady from the southeast, when the fog pressed the air down, when the grid was carrying more than usual because of the humidity and the hotels on the strip were full. Those were the nights the Hollow Mile hummed loud enough for people to mention it on their own. Is there a generator running back there? Do you guys feel that in your chest? Those were the nights the staff saw doubles not just in the glass, but in the windows of the food stands and the puddles on the boards. A kid threw a rock into one of those puddles and swore the splash lagged behind the stone. In May 1994, a seasonal hire found a cardboard box in the funhouse attic behind a crawlspace door no one remembered. Inside were 31 VHS tapes with no labels. The security office thought they were training videos. They were not. The park did not own the camera that had made them. The first tape shows the interior of the Hollow Mile as it was in 1991, before the fall overlay. Same corridors, different graffiti. The shot is handheld, steady, close to the walls. The tape is 32 minutes long. For the first 27 minutes, nothing happens that would trouble anyone but a building inspector. At 27 minutes and 9 seconds, a figure appears in the glass a step behind the camera, in the frame, but not in the corridor. It is a man with a long face and a smile too small. He raises his hand. The camera shakes once, sharply, as if the person holding it felt a cold draft. Then the tape ends, as though it ran out, but the counter shows 5 minutes remaining. The next tape begins and ends with snow. By the end of that summer, the park was short on cash and long on rumors. The management had delayed maintenance on the coaster, the pier pilings needed jackets. The arcade smell was not just mildew anymore. It was the sweetness of anything that had been wet too long. They needed a hit. Delaney pitched another overlay, this time year-round. Add sound triggers to the Hollow Mile that would react to guest voices, draw them deeper. He used phrases like interactive architecture and responsive environment. The park board voted no. Delaney left the meeting white-cheeked with anger, and management put out a tender for fresh designers for the next season. In October 1994, Delaney left Ashdown for a residency in Arizona. 3 months later, he returned without fanfare and without a contract. He rented a month-to-month room at the Ocean Crest Motel and paid cash. Around New Year's, the pier had one of those small tragedies that look bigger in hindsight. A vendor named Paulo fell through a loose plank at the south end of the boardwalk and twisted his ankle. He lay there in the cold while people stepped around him, murmuring apologies. He said later that from the hole he could see seawater breathing in the dark, rising and falling without sound. In the ER notes, a nurse wrote that Paulo asked twice whether there were lights under the pier. Blue lights, like a hospital. The nurse replied no and marked that the patient appeared confused. Spring 1995 was lean. The park rehired attendants but cut hours. The Hollow Mile opened first because it was cheap to run. The attendant at the door revised the spiel. No running, no touching the glass. If you get separated, stop and raise your hand and staff will assist. She did not say, if you see yourself already at the next turn, do not follow. A month into the season, a drifter with the look of a student who had stopped being a student showed up with a SLR camera and asked to photograph the Hollow Mile for a magazine that did not exist. He had read about the funhouse in a message board devoted to liminal spaces and thin places, a vocabulary that would later become a cliche but then felt like a key. The park said no. He bought a ticket and went in with everyone else. He came out pale and flipping the film release rapidly, as if he wanted the sound to drown out another one. He told the attendant that the camera did not wind properly in the labyrinth, that the frames overlapped. "Thought your right ate my film," he said, and smiled too wide. The photos developed fine. They just showed two sets of guests in each frame, one sharp, one a half stop behind. It wasn't double exposure. The lab said so. The lab suggested a light leak. The photographer threw the photos away at a gas station en route north. He told someone much later that he fished them out of the trash a mile down the road and stuffed them back in the envelope with shaking hands. That summer had its own set of storms. One of them hit on a Saturday. The park was full of honeymooners and families and people who could not afford Atlantic City. The sky went yellow. The wind dropped. The whole strip felt like it held its breath. The grid sagged. You could see it in the popcorn machines and hear it in the fluorescent buzz. The Hollow Mile swallowed guests at its usual rate. A woman inside felt her mouth go dry the way it does with fear before your body knows. She stopped and raised her hand. No attendant came. That was the rule. It had worked 100 times. Nobody came. On the security feed, the camera marked with a piece of masking tape reading HM3 went to snow and then came back a fraction of an inch off, as if someone had jogged the bracket. When it returned, the corridor showed a stray balloon someone had let go earlier in the day. The balloon was now strange, unpopped, but dented like a skull. The woman made it out. Most people always did. She reported cold air and voices that were almost mine. When the attendant smiled and said it was a soundtrack effect, the woman closed her eyes and said very quietly, "Please do not condescend to me." In October 1995, the park canceled blackout nights. They blamed budget. The truth, a night watchman named Corcoran had given notice after a shift where the clocks in the funhouse all stopped at 2:17 a.m., and the radio on his belt stuttered like a breath. In his written exit memo, Corcoran wrote something he scratched out twice and left legible the third time. "It knows me now." The park did not ask for clarification. Winter returned, the pier braced. Someone, no one will say who, used influence to get a small grant for safety modernization. The Hollow Mile was to be rewired in March 1996. When the electricians opened the panels, they found the expected salt damage and something else they recorded with a disposable camera and then never showed the park. Resin running in hairline threads down the back of one mirror like sap from a tree in spring. It smelled faintly of ozone. The electricians wore gloves and said as little as possible. The work finished 2 weeks late. The warranty card for the new breakers was filled out with a shaky hand. The Hollow Mile reopened on a Tuesday with hardly anyone in line. It was early season, school was still in. The hum in the ceiling had changed, lower, steadier, like a big cat asleep. The staff said it felt calmer. The first days were uneventful. Then, word of mouth resumed its work. Couples came on dares, coworkers dragged coworkers after shifts, girls walked in with boys their parents would not like. The exit photos, cheap flash, fisheye lens, a sheet of glossy printer paper sold as always. In 3 of them taken in April, the same pale man stands a step behind the group. The group changes, he does not. Later that month, obscured by the noise of 1,000 smaller concerns, the Hollow Mile recorded what the maintenance log called an overcount. The turnstile at the entrance registered 47 guests. The count at the exit registered 48. The attendant at the door blamed a sticky paw. The attendant at the exit shrugged and said the counter was ancient. A manager initialed the log and drew a smiley face because he was trying to keep morale up. 2 days later, the inverse occurred. The exit counted 1 fewer than the entrance. The manager did not draw a smiley face. He underlined the numbers and told himself not to feel superstitious. 2 weeks after that, the park hosted a corporate picnic for a discount phone company trying to act bigger than it was. They rented the funhouse for a private hour because the boss liked to frighten his employees just enough. They drank more than you should on a wooden pier and went in 2 by 2. The boss's assistant carried a disposable camera. Her photos came back with a weird grain, like rain you can't see. In one of them, the boss is reflected sharply on one panel, blurred on the panel beside it, and missing entirely on the panel that should have shown him at the angle he was standing at. The assistant turned the photo over and wrote nothing on the back because she could not think of how to describe what was wrong without sounding like a child. When summer finally crested, the park did what it always had. It attempted a spectacle it could not afford. On August 17, 1996, to mark Ashdown Night, the management scheduled a short midnight show at the end of the pier. Canned music, confetti cannons, the Ferris wheel lights synced to a sequence Delaney had designed back when things felt possible. T-shirts were printed. A radio station set up a booth. The sky was clear in that way that makes you suspicious because the day has been too hot. The crowd pressed in. Teenagers climbed the fencing to sit swinging their legs above the black. The announcer talked too much. At 11:58 p.m., the park dimmed all lights for the countdown. The effect was supposed to be surprise. The pier went darker than planned. The dimmers cut too far. The crowd made that little sound crowds make when they are not sure if they are being delighted or endangered. The Ferris wheel lights came up a fraction late and the pier cheered. The cannons misfired and confetti came down like a sudden dry snow. At midnight, as the old speakers crackled out a tinny fanfare, power on the south sub-panel flickered and the funhouse doors, tied shut for the evening, swung 3 inches and settled. An attendant swore, another told her to relax. The power cut again. When it came back, it wasn't right. The bulbs came up too bright and then too dim. The hum in the funhouse dropped into a tone the attendants could feel in the bones of their faces. The confetti on the boards shifted as though a breath had passed over it. Far out to sea, lightning grinned without sound. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Ooh," because that's what people do when they don't know what they're feeling. The park's little PA swallowed its own echo and spit it back. And then for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the park listened to itself. The security footage from the funhouse shows a blank corridor and then not blank. It shows movement without a mover, a ripple like heat above a road. It shows the blue indicators on the emergency fixtures flaring and fading as if someone were throttling the current with a warm hand. The audio from the same camera is supposed to be nothing but hiss. Instead, it catches a voice so faint you only know it is a voice when you compare it to the hiss before and after. It says, very distinctly, "Don't run." The power returned properly at 12:03. The staff exhaled and pretended nothing had happened because the crowd took its cue from the staff. The park closed late that night. The attendants swept confetti into gray piles that looked like small dead things. Somebody found a shoe under a bench and left it at guest services. It sat there until morning, and then it was gone. The morning after, the hollow mile counted itself again. The numbers matched. Nobody mentioned the overcounts except in the maintenance shack, where Luis repeated that breakers do not behave like wishes. "It's not magic," he said, and then, because he was not a man given to superstition, "It's not." 2 weeks later, a boy with a blue wristband that said Ashdown Night in cracked paint marker vanished in the funhouse for 10 minutes. He came out holding the hand of a woman who was not his mother, and then looked down at his hand and screamed, because it was empty. The staff swore the boy had been alone. The boy's mother slapped the exit mirror with her flat hand and left a print that did not fade for days. Security called it a disturbance. The log called it child found, exit foyer. The attendant who had seen the boy first called it something she could not say out loud. If you ask the people who still live in Ashdown why the park closed, they will say it was money. If you stand with them long enough, if you buy them one more beer and keep your mouth closed, if you let the silence hold without helping, they will say the park closed because of October. October 5th, 1996, the night the fog came in too fast. The park should have closed in weather like that, but it was a Saturday on a long weekend, and you do not close when the parking lot is full. The fog made the rides more beautiful, everything haloed, the Ferris wheel turning in its own little heaven. The line at the hollow mile wrapped back on itself like a coil. The attendants clicked people through, learned faces, said the same sentence until it became just noise. At 9:12 p.m., the breaker on the funhouse main tripped and did not reset. At 9:14, it reset itself, which it could not do. It tripped again at 9:16. Luis was already there, cursing. He opened the panel. The smell that came out was not burnt insulation. It was not fish or salt or mildew. He could not name it and later would try to and fail. He reset the breaker. It held. He radioed the supervisor Green and closed the panel and heard a sound like someone breathing behind the door. He told himself he heard the sea. Inside, guests reported the cold again. This time it carried weight, like weather that had been somewhere far and was tired. A girl said she saw her father in a panel 2 turns ahead, leaning to look at her from a place he could not be. A young man said he felt a hand at the small of his back where there was only glass. A woman whispered in a corridor where she believed she was alone, "I can't do this." And a voice, not hers, whispered the same words a heartbeat later, with love in it. At 9:27, the fire alarms across the south end of the pier chimed once together and went quiet. The panel lights did not show alarm. The logs would later use phrases like phantom trip and no fault found. At 9:30, the PA in the funhouse corridor spoke without being keyed. The voice was male, and it said, "Ladies and gentlemen, please proceed to the nearest." And then it eroded into the hum and grew again into a tone louder than the PA could have produced. People put their hands to their ears and looked up without knowing why. There are 3 accounts of what happened next, and they agree on the outline and not on the details. They agree that the lights went out and came back at a brightness that hurt. They agree that the mirrors held the light longer than the air, like eyes adjusting in the wrong direction. They agree that an unseasonal wind moved through the corridors, though the doors were closed. One account, a man who would years later recant and then reinstate, says that the glass fogged from breath on the other side. Another, the boy with the blue wristband grown into an adult who still tapped his thighs with 2 fingers when talking, said that he saw people he loved in the panels. His grandmother living, his mother younger, himself at 7 with a scrape on his cheek. He had only seen in one Polaroid. He put his hand to the glass and swore it was warmer than the air. The third account is Mara's, the attendant. She said the corridor bent where it had not before. She could feel it in her feet like a ship rolling. She said she heard the voice again telling them not to run, and she did not. She said she saw a man in the service corridor without a jacket where the air was freezing, a man she did not know and knew. Long face, small smile. He raised his hand. She did not. She sets her jaw even now when asked. I did not raise mine. I am not a mirror. At 9:34, the pier's main transformer complained aloud. At 9:35, a short, the kind that blackens a contact and makes a smell you remember in your clothes. The lights wavered. The confetti from August, the pieces that had been swept into the cracks between the boards and never fully gone, rose in a small spiral under no one's breath. Someone screamed. Several someones screamed. The attendant at the exit began to count nothing out loud, because counting was a rope she could climb. 1, 2, 3, until the numbers felt like marbles in her mouth. When the power settled, if that is the word, there were fewer people in the corridor than there had been. The logs say 18 in, 15 out. The counters say malfunction. The newspaper says a brief closure due to a guest incident. The police blotter says lost child recovered. Guest panic, no medical transport. The emergency room remembers a night of people who arrived without injuries and could not stop shivering. The park closed early without saying so aloud. Staff drove home with their radios off because the radios were making whispers. A manager turned his key in the office door and found a stack of VHS tapes on the desk that had not been there. The top tape had the word return written in Sharpie in a hand none of them recognized. He put the tapes in a drawer and locked it. The key felt warm. The park opened the next morning and the funhouse did too. Corporate was called. Insurance was called. This is how these stories always move toward their ends. Not with an exorcism, but with a meeting. The Hollow Mile remained on the schedule through the end of the month. The season limped to its last weekend. The air got that iron taste it gets when the sea is going to change. The blue lamps above the service corridor ticked at 2:17 a.m. each night for no reason any manual would admit. On the last night, the attendant at the entrance reset the counter to 0 and watched it climb with a look on her face like someone watching rain measure itself. On the last night, a couple went in holding hands and came out holding hands and swore later that for one moment inside they were holding the hands of people who were not each other. On the last night, Mara walked the service corridor with a flashlight and did not look into the panels because she had learned that respect is a form of bravery. And then in the small hours after the boards had been hosed and the arcade's clatter silenced, after the vendors had counted their tills and the night watch had made his rounds, after the sea had come in and said what it always says against the pilings, the park shut off the lights, one section at a time. The funhouse was last. The hum in the ceiling dwindled and died. The exit sign held its green, then let it go, and the glass went black until it was only the room. In the office, the manager put the key beside the drawer and said out loud to no one, "We did our best." He was wrong, but he believed it. Ashdown Pier did not open the following season. The official cause was debt and deferred maintenance. The funhouse was bolted. The mirrors were left where they were. The sea asked for the nails back one by one. Years later, teens climbed the fencing and dared each other to go in with phone flashlights, and the stories they told were the old ones in new clothes, a cold draft, a voice behind you that uses your name before you say it, the feeling that turning your head would be a mistake. A kid posted a video in the comments filled with laughter and shaky nope. He took it down that night without saying why. When the town finally voted to condemn the pier, a court order allowed 2 days for salvaging equipment. Luis came back with a union crew to take what could be taken. The copper, the breakers, the fixtures that could be repurposed in buildings that still had futures. He saved the fun house for last because he's a man who believes in leaving the hardest job for when the day has made you honest. He unscrewed the backplates with a metal smell filling his mouth. He found the resin again and the way it crusted like salt around the edges of one panel. He lifted the panel with another man and set it against the wall and saw in the dim sleep-drained light of the service corridor the faintest print of a hand at the height of a child, 5 fingers spread wide, palm pad smeared. He put his glove to it and did not match it. He did not take the panel. He put his wrench down and walked into the night and stood on the pier's edge and wept that careful, private weeping that belongs to men who know something they cannot name has touched them. He told no one. The crew took the copper and left the glass. The pier came down in sections over a winter with kind weather. The boards were stacked and sold, the pilings cut and left to rot. the ride skeletons hauled away under tarps that flapped and made the sound of giant breath. The hollow mile was the last standing because the excavator operator, who had seen plenty, refused to be the one to put a bucket through the mirrors. A different operator took the contract. The claw rose, the glass shattered in silence as if it had been pre-broken long ago. Even then, in the ruins, the corridors looked like they might still lead somewhere. The operator scraped until there was nothing left but a rectangle of concrete, and even that he broke, because concrete can remember. There is a storage unit in town that used to be a small church, and in the back of that unit is a metal cabinet with a drawer that does not quite shut. In the drawer are the things no one wanted. Dusty cash drawers, a stack of uniforms, 2 emergency lanterns that have not held a charge in 20 years, and a cardboard box of VHS tapes with no labels. Someone has written the word "don't" on the box, and someone else has crossed it out. The tapes inside are blanks when you play them on a modern machine. They are not blanks when you play them on a player of the right era that hums at the right frequency. Then they are corridors, and the corridor is you, and the person holding the camera does not breathe. And there is the other thing, the thing that makes me speak at all, the Polaroid Mara kept, the one that changed. It lives in a frame on a bookshelf now behind other frames because she married and had a child and learned to fold her life around the fold that would not close. If you look too quickly, it is only a blank. If you look with the patience the old world demands, the image blooms slowly, like bruises. There is Mara at 19. There is the other attendant who is not the girl she was. There is the corridor behind them with the little blue star lamps. There is the panel that shows a man with a long face and a small smile, raising his hand in a gesture that can mean hello and can mean be still. If you look longer than that, the room gets cold. Sometimes at night, when the air is wrong and the streetlights burn that off-color white, the windows of the buildings along the strip catch a reflection from nowhere. A strange geometry of light that presses itself onto glass, a zig of corridor where there is no corridor to reflect. The locals shut their blinds without ceremony because nothing good waits in a window that wants to be a doorway. And once in a while, a kid who was 12 in 1996 stands at his sink and sees in the dark square of the kitchen window, not his face but the pier at night, the Ferris wheel turning in fog that has learned his name. He does what the voice told him a long time ago. He does not run. He waits until the light bends back into the room. He turns on the overhead and looks at the floor until the white hum under the world ebbs away. Officially, the park closed because money closes things. Officially, the Hollow Mile was a set of corridors with mirrors, and mirrors do what they are told by light. Officially, the boy with the blue wristband went to college inland and forgot that the sea knocks. Officially, Mara changed her name when she married and does not answer emails about that job. Officially, Luis retired and takes a lawn chair to the beach at dawn and watches the horizon and can tell the difference between lightning and something else, and does not correct anyone who cannot. Officially, there is no such thing as a building that remembers you. But I know, because you can taste the truth at the back of your tongue the way you can taste thunder, that the funhouse taught the town a language nobody wanted to speak. The language of reflection that is not yours. The language of a hum that tells you there is another hum underneath it. The language of feeling watched by something that is not a person and not a god, but understands the enormous politeness of hands at your sides and the refusal to run. If you go down there now in winter when the tourists have gone, and the wind off the ocean is straight and serious, you can stand on the beach where the pier used to begin. The sand is darker under the spot where the funhouse sat. It has nothing to do with shade. The water comes in, goes out, and leaves a pattern that looks like corridors if you are the sort who sees patterns. At the edge of the surf, sometimes the foam holds a shape, an oval, an eye, a loop folded over itself. You can shake your head and say it's only water. You can walk away. But if you are the sort to listen, you will hear, faint, patient, like a building remembering the people who were kind to it, the smallest whisper, "Don't run." And if you catch yourself in a window at night, in the room you know, and you see yourself pause for a fraction after your body has already moved, if you feel the cold that is not a draft, if you hear the tone that is not tinnitus, you will have a choice. You can lift your hand and answer the gesture the glass has kept for you all these years. Or you can keep your hands by your sides and let the reflection be a reflection and nothing more. I advise you, as someone who has stood with the sea in my mouth and the hum in my bones, as someone who has counted without numbers in a corridor that bends away corridors cannot, that you do not raise your hand, that you do not say hello, that you remember the rule that was never printed on any sign because the truth belongs to evenings and not to paper. The mirrors do not show what they see. They show what wants to be seen. And wanting, like electricity, finds a way through. So if a friend suggests a drive to the shore to find what isn't there anymore, and you go because you are the sort of person who cannot help himself, and you stand where the pier began and hold your breath without meaning to, and the dark makes a shape which your mind insists is nothing. and you hear me in your head because you are thinking of this, the last thing I will tell you is the first thing I was told: go home when the lights go wrong. Look at the floor when the glass gets ideas. And if you hear a man behind you with a smile in his voice say don't run, thank him with your stillness and leave. Because some places are not haunted by the dead. They are haunted by the moment a person realizes the world has another layer, and that the layer might have been noticing them for years and has learned their name. And that was only the beginning. Ashdown Pier didn't sleep that night, and what came after would make the disappearance of the Hollow family look almost ordinary. Tomorrow, you'll hear what really happened when the lights went out for good. So if you've made it this far, subscribe. Because this story isn't over, and when the second part drops, you'll want to be here to see how deep the mirrors really went.